Cathy Buchanan has written 3 novels, most recently Daughter of Black Lake, which was chosen as Best Fiction for Fall by Entertainment Weekly and Parade Magazine. Her other bestsellers are The Painted Girls, and her debut novel, The Day the Falls Stood Still, was a New York Times bestseller, a Barnes & Noble Recommend selection, and a Canada Reads Top 40 Essential Canadian Novels of the Decade. Her work has been translated into 9 languages. Cathy holds a Bachelor of Science, honors biochemistry, and an MBA from Western University. A recently certified yoga instructor, Cathy Buchanan lives in Toronto. Brunonia Barry, raised in Marblehead, is a Salem resident. She's the New York Times and international best-selling author of The Lace Reader, The Map of True Places, and The Fifth Petal. A cable series based on Lace Reader and The Fifth Petal is in development with NBC Universal. She's putting the finishing touches on her newest novel, The Island of Mother and Daughters. A multiple award winner, Brunonia has served as chair of the Salem Athenaeum's Writers Committee and executive director of the Salem Literary Festival.
I have to give a background of my relationship with Cathy. I knew her mostly online first. We're in a group of writers that get together from time to time. And I was called by her publisher before Daughter of Black Lake came out, asking me if I would be interested in blurbing it. And it's interesting when, as a writer, when you're asked to blurb a book, you always want to. And I luckily I'm a big fan. I love The Painted Girls. It's one of my favorite books. And NPR chose that as one of the best books of the year. And I read it immediately and loved it. And now I have also read The Day the Fall Stood Still, and she's just a wonderful writer. But you still, you get the book in the mail and or online as we got it, and open it and just hold your breath because you just don't know. And I also don't generally read fiction when I'm writing it. And I was mid The Island of Mothers and Daughters. But I read 2 pages and then I put down The Island of Mothers and Daughters, much to my agent's chagrin, and just read for days. Actually not too many days, a few days, and I was done. And I just I hated closing the back cover, to tell you the truth, because she's created such a world. This is probably the longest blurb I've ever written, and I'm going to read you part of it that is abridged.
It's my favorite blurb, by the way.
Is it? Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to turn this over to Cathy. But evocative and deftly paced, Daughter of Black Lake conjures both landscape and ancestral memory, transporting us to a time and place we have not yet lived and yet somehow recognize, where a young girl must save her family from the perils of history's unrelenting forward march. Family bonds, a mother's secret, a new kind of heroic journey that's the perfect antidote for our uncertain times. And I really mean that. And I guess you can tell I enjoyed it. With that said, I really want to get right to the book and have Cathy tell us a little bit something about it before we go on, because I have so many questions. Anyway, Cathy, on to you.
Okay, so a little bit about Daughter of Black Lake. It is a story of love and survival set 2,000 years ago in the northern misty boglands of pagan Britain. It is in part narrated by Devout, who is the healer at Black Lake, and in part by her 13-year-old daughter, Hobble. When the book opens, life in Black Lake is simple, or so it seems to the community of bog dwellers who lives there, farming the land and honoring the gods, much as have their ancestors for thousands of years. But true to history, it's year 43, the Romans have invaded. They are inching their way westward across Britain, drawing ever closer to this remote settlement. Hobble, the 13-year-old girl in Daughter of Black Lake, is prone to visions that are more and more often proving true. And she has a vision of these Romans approaching. as if that's not enough, anxiety mounts even further when a fanatical druid, so one of the powerful high priests of the day, comes to Black Lake to stir up rebellion against the Romans. And Hobble, with her prophesying, becomes, the druid's chief adversary.
And quite an adversary, actually. I'm fascinated. Just for a minute, I want to talk about the names in the book.
Right.
It's very interesting the way you name the characters. There's so much to characterization anyway, but this went quite a ways, I think, toward giving us certainly a first impression. But how did you come up with the names for the
The Britons did not have the written word, so they didn't leave us a written record of how they lived. So we have to, sort of intuit a lot of it, or use sort of informed speculation. We know today that there's lots of people that have the surname Hunter or Tanner or Smith or Carpenter. And we assume that those names have come down across the ages because people at one point were named after their traditions. And we also have, names like Faith and Charity, where presumably people are, at some point, those names came into being because people were named after personality traits. So what I chose to do in Daughter of Black Lake was the hunter is called Hunter. The Hunter clan are the hunters. The blacksmith is called Smith. The carpenter is called Carpenter. Devout is called Devout because she has this great devotion to Mother Earth. Hobble is called Hobble because she walks with a limp. And I kind of, this naming convention extends beyond the people. Places in Daughter of Black Lake are named after their physical setting. So Black Lake is called Black Lake. Edge, which is a cliff face, is called Edge. Hill Fort, which is a hill town with a fort, is called Hill Fort. So, there is some evidence when you look at some of the names in old names of places in Britain. Some of them in Old English are things like the way we would have said salt marsh. So I just tried to, sort of stick with that convention and name things after physical or character attributes. And people have thanked me too, because when you do open this book, you are coming into a whole community. And I know when I'm, opening a new novel and there's a whole cast of characters, lots of times I'm noting things on the, the cover because it gets confusing. But here, the hunter is the hunter. We all get it.
I love that, actually. So, well, I want to mention one of the characters, Fox, is very interesting. I thought the choice of his name was quite interesting. How did you pick that name?
Okay, so Fox is the druid character in Black Lake, and he was inspired by a real life person that lived 2,000 years ago. And we know about this person because he is a bog body. So bog bodies are bodies that went into the bogs, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And because of the chemical nature of the body, the chemical nature of the peat bog, the body is preserved across the millennia. So Fox is based on Lindo Man, who was a bog body who was dug up in the peat bog formed by the once much larger Black Lake in Cheshire, UK. So Black Lake is a real place. The bog body, Lindo Man, has matted red hair. So that could be the reason he was called Fox. There's a lot of speculation. This body's been studied extensively, and there is quite a bit of speculation that Fox actually resided at Black Lake as a druid, so one of the high priests of the time. They also found a armband on him that had a piece of fox fur. So there's some speculation that perhaps he was from a fox clan. So anyway, those couple of reasons I decided to name him Fox. And also he's a very cunning, sort of crafty man. And, Hobble at one point in the story is wondering why he is called Fox. And is it because of his red hair, or is it because he's, sly like a fox?
Yes. Good question. You have to read the book to find out, everyone. What inspired you to write a novel that's set in first century?
Yeah. So it was almost 20 years ago. I opened up the newspaper to see a photograph of one of these bog bodies. It was an unnervingly well-preserved 2,000-year-old body. it was wild. You could see the fine creases in the skin. You could see the razor stubble. You could see the matted hair peeking out from underneath the leather cap. The rope noose that brought death was still looped around the neck. The article went on to explain that the chemical nature of the water had preserved this body across 2,000 years, so that in our modern times, you know, we dig these bodies up when the peat harvesters are harvesting the peat. Yeah, anyway, I got really curious about these so-called bog bodies. I started looking at a dozen of them. And one in particular, Lindo Man, really captivated me. And as I mentioned, Lindo Man is a bog body that went into the peat bog at Black Lake in Cheshire, UK. He's been heavily studied. Speculation that he is a druid, one of the high priests. I got curious about the time period that he lived in. I found it fascinating that he would have been part of a society that lived and breathed its daily and seasonal rituals, and that was bound to the land in the most sort of profound way. And I decided, as I was researching Lindo Man, that I would write a story that had what we know about Lindo Man as its bedrock, but that really explored living in Iron Age Britain, how these pagans lived their daily lives.
Interesting. I lived in Dublin for a while, and I toured a place called St. Michan's Church in Dublin. And there were the bodies of, it was in the basement of a church, very down quite far. And the preserved bodies of crusaders. And with everything that you're describing, just as if it had happened yesterday. And yet in Dublin, or at least with the people that gave the tour, they said it's very, very good luck because the hands are crossed like this, to touch the crossed hands of the arms of the crusader. And so I got up my nerve and I did, and it haunted me ever since, to tell you the truth. But it was quite an amazing thing to see. I haven't seen the bog bodies, but
I mean, it's hard to look at one of these ancient bodies and not try, you know, think about what was their life like and what did they have in common with me and what was different, you know? So
exactly.
I mean, it happens when I'm looking at old photographs too. You sort of just delve into like, who is this person? You know, I don't know.
It's really true. Now that leads me to ask you about research, because I know from your other books, but also just from having talked to you a bit, that you love to do research, I think.
Right.
And but this is a very interesting thing because there's no written record of anything going back. And as you said, the Romans had a little bit of a record, but can you believe them? So talk a little about that. It must be. Tell us about the challenges and joys.
Yeah. Okay. So challenges first. I mean, this book was so tough to research. And I think there were a couple of things that made it complicated. Like generally when I'm setting out to write a work of historical fiction, I have sort of a research period up front where I'm researching for 4 to 6 months. And really I'm just reading text, and I often read the literature of the day. But as Brunonia mentioned, the Britons did not have the written word 2,000 years ago, so they left us no record of how they lived. And then the Romans have lots to say, but because they subjugated and conquered the Britons, we have to read it with a great deal of skepticism. So there's the archaeological record, but that could be incredibly frustrating too, because, you know, one artifact, a particular archaeologist would say it was for ceremonial purposes, and the next would suggest that it was for, you know, cooking. So in a quandary, I hired an archaeologist with an expertise in Iron Age Britain, and he took me and 2 of my sons on a tour of the relevant archaeological sites in the UK. I remember a real epiphany on that trip. We were standing looking at one of the hill forts. So these hill forts, there's about 3,300 of them in the UK. They're these you know, mounds that dot the British landscape, and they often have sort of ramparts or defensive ditches. So as I'm standing there gazing at the hill fort in the distance, you know, the archaeologist tells me some of the evidence suggests that they were inhabited. Some suggest that it wasn't. Some suggest that they were for ceremonial purposes. Some suggest that they were defensive in nature. Some think they were cattle enclosures. And he just went on and on and on. And I was like, I get it. this is why a clear picture is not emerging for me. Like, we don't really know what was happening 2000 years ago. So more so than my other two novels, Daughter of Black Lake, I really had to rely on informed speculation and a whole lot of magic or imagination to create the world at Daughter of Black Lake. So, I mean, incredibly frustrating at the beginning, but once I had that realization, it was really very liberating to be able to make up as much stuff as I made up. On the joy side of researching this novel, I had to delve into the mythology of the British Isles, which was super fascinating to me, and also take a look at, the pagan and medieval superstitions and practices. And I really felt that by I would in these practices that have come down over the years, I would find the root of what things were like in the Iron Age. And some of my most joyful moments came when I would come upon an old tradition and see that how it was reflected in our modern day. So for instance, we know that in pagan times, the Britons made a habit of throwing things that were precious into watery places in order to draw the benevolence of the gods. So we find, highly decorated swords and cauldrons in springs and in bogs. And I think that is reflected in our modern day practice of throwing coins into water fountains to have good luck. It seems to me that our tradition of jack-o'-lanterns must be rooted in the Iron Age pagan tradition of, collecting the heads of your enemies and using them to ward off, they would, when they were skulls, ward off bad luck, malevolence. So in Daughter of Black Lake, one of these skulls, they get it out on the night of the departed and stick a rushlight inside. And I'm hoping that as readers are reading their book, they're going to say, oh, that's where the jack-o'-lantern came from. So I think there is other instances in the book where I hope readers have that same experience that I did, where they sort of recognize something from pagan times in our modern day practices. And it's one of the reasons I like that blurb that Brunonia gave me so much, where you sort of comment on how familiar things felt. And I had that feeling when I was researching this book, that even though it was this like far off time and place, so much felt familiar. And it really did make me think that, my pagan roots are, in my bones in some way.
That's how I felt when I read it. I thought there is this thing of ancestral memory that I believe very much in.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's, even scientifically, I think one of the latest discoveries is we pick up the traumas and some of the other things of 2 generations ago without knowing this. But think back to some of the things we just have inbred. We have a few members of the pagan community in Salem here, I'm sure, tonight. And I think you should come to Salem sometime.
I would love
to see how many of the holidays.
I think when this pandemic is over, I'm just going to travel. I'm going to go everywhere.
You should. You should. It's very interesting how it all fits together. Do you teach at all? And you teach yoga, yes?
I teach yoga, yeah.
Okay. Do you teach writing?
I've done the odd workshop, but I haven't had a regular writing teaching.
Yeah, that's what I do. But I'm always talking about creating. I just did something about creating the world of a story. And one of the things I always tell anyone in my class is that I think the best way to do it, and for me, that's kind of what people say I do better than other things. We won't say what I do wrong, but one of the things I do fairly well is create worlds that you may not understand. And, and one of the things that I always tell students is, in order to create a full world, it's important to try to use all your 5 senses, and get them somehow into your story. It's a hard thing to do. But I have to say, your story is full of sensory details that bring all the routines to life so vividly. And I felt where I was. I felt the grass, the water, the I felt the secrets, but that's just the extrasensory side of me. But anyway, I'd love you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I had this, one of the, more than any place that I visited when I went on this tour of the UK, the site that most shaped or informed Daughter of Black Lake was a place called Butser Ancient Farm. So Butser Ancient Farm is sort of a pioneer village like complex, except that it's dedicated to educating about the Iron Age versus pioneer times. So I get to Butser Ancient Farm. It's surrounded by a wattle fence, so a fence woven together sticks. It surrounds 6 reconstructed roundhouses, so the kinds of dwellings that the bog dwellers at Black Lake would have lived in 2,000 years ago. As I passed through this wattle fence into this enclave of roundhouses, I felt like I was stepping back in time. And here comes all the 5 senses, but I could hear the clang, clang, clang of a blacksmith at work. I could smell, the thatch warming in the sun. I could smell the wet wool of the sheep. I could see the, Celtic motifs that were covering the walls. And I had one day to drink it all in, and I was, so thrilled. So, I went to one of these roundhouses and, stepped inside and patiently waited for my eyes to adjust to the dim lights, took a look around, saw the cauldron hanging over the fire pit at the center of the roundhouse. I saw the low benches circling the walls, the, beds covered in furs, the kern, the stone that they would have used to grind their wheat. There was plant dyed wool hanging on the walls, so I stood there, I drank it all in. I really felt the mystery and magic of the place, and I think in part it shaped the level to which magic is a part of Black Lake. Like I just really felt the place was permeated with magic.
That's going to be my next question. Actually, I was going to lead.
Yeah, no, it was an amazing experience, and I've had a couple of funny things where I was posting some pictures on Instagram of Butser Ancient Farm. And I had so many readers comment, that's exactly what I pictured. So I was like, okay, I've done my job, and then the other interesting thing, I was doing an event the other night and I started calling Butser Ancient Farm Black Lake. So, for sure when I was writing Daughter of Black Lake, I went back to that magical day, on a regular basis, but I was like, oh my goodness, Buchanan, separate your fact from fiction. That is Butser Ancient Farm. Black Lake is imaginary. Yeah, so kind of cool.
Great. That's when it works,
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's probably all sorts of coincidence that happens that you, I always find the road rises to meet you, so to speak, that there are certain things that you think you're totally imagining and they turn out to be true. Or I don't know if you had any of these surprises when you were writing the book. I know when I wrote The Lace Reader, I did not expect the end of the book to be what it was. And I had something else planned, but at some point the characters took over and propelled the book to where it went. Did you have any of that? Because you have very strong characters in this.
I mean, I knew what I was writing toward because I stuck to the known. I won't say what I'm writing toward because it'll spoil too much of the plot. But I knew a lot about Lindo Mann's life, so that sort of set what the ending was going to be. But I didn't know exactly how I was going to get there. And this book changed dramatically over the editorial process, more than any other book I've written. So, once you sell the book, you start working with a professional editor. On my other 2 novels, that had sort of been 4 to 6 months. On this novel, it was 2.5 years. There was a couple of massive rewrites. The book changed dramatically over that course. So, when did the book turn out differently than I thought it was? Yes. So, I mean, one of the most dramatic things that happened was, so the book is told in part by Devout, this healer at Black Lake, and in part by her 13-year-old daughter, Hobble. So the half of the book that is told by Hobble used to be told by her father. So initially it was told by a 33-year-old man. It was, third person past tense. And now it's told by his 13-year-old prophetic daughter, first person present tense. So a gigantic change. And, you know, the editorial process, it was long. The book wasn't coming together. I felt like it was falling apart rather than coming together. And then when I made that change, I feel like it was when the book actually became what it is today, and when it, you know, became what I wanted the book to be.
Yeah.
Interestingly, one of my dear writer friends, Anya Sato, who Brunonia knows as well, we've been friends for a long time. We've always been each other's first readers. So when she read an early version of Daughter of Lake, probably 5 years ago, she said to me, "Oh, I wish we could be in Hobble's head. Like, how interesting to be inside a seer's head. Can we please be inside Hobble's head?" And I was like, cool idea, but that's way too much work. I'm not doing it. And then I rewrite the book 10 times and then I do it, you know? So the moral of that story is listen to Anya Sato.
Very good. I'm calling her.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about being a seer. Let's talk about the magic a little more. I mean, I had a character in The Lace Reader who could see the future. Not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, is it more of a curse or a blessing? Well, I know the end of the book, so I don't give anything away. But how was that to write?
You know, I really loved writing the magical parts of the book. I think, you know, in part, I go back to that wonderful day I had at Butts Range Farm. I also think that magic really would have been integral to the way that the bog dwellers experience the world. So they didn't have science to explain the nighttime sky or the origins of mankind. You know, they would have explained these things using magic. Also, you know, Devout, the book's healer, when she is making a remedy from meadowsweet to cure a headache, she's not sitting there thinking, oh, I'm, you know, taking the salicylic acid out of this meadowsweet and it will cure a headache. She is thinking, I am taking Mother Earth's magic from this meadowsweet, and it is Mother Earth that will cure this headache using magic. So I like that idea. So I think in part the magic is there because I just believe it's the way that the world would have been without science. They would have relied on magic to explain things. And I think that's a lovely way to live. And when you're undertaking to write a novel, you know that you are going to be, you know, your head is going to be in a particular place for a couple of years. And for me, I loved the idea of, you know, sort of immersing myself in a community that mystery and magic was part of the daily life there. So, yeah.
And so many things, so many herbs and things like that that you've used and that we've discovered are used still.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a tricky thing to research the herbs. The first complicating thing was I had to make sure whenever I mentioned an herb that it was native to Britain, because if it wasn't native to Britain, it wasn't there. You know, they were not importing herbs from India 2000 years ago. So yeah, I had to make sure things were native to Britain, and then go about researching how they might have been used and how they might have been prepared. And I was struck. There was one ancient herb garden that I went to at one of the sites I visited. And so much of what was growing there are things that we still use in the present day.
So true. Yes. And even more so now around here. I don't know if anyone ever goes down to Artemisia Botanicals, but I've dropped by a lot. And one of the characters one of the people that I sort of modeled a character in my book after is the owner of that. And she helps me with a lot of herbal, interesting details that I don't know. But I also go down if I have a cold or anything else, see what her advice is. Don't drink the garlic paste that's been there for 3 years, but it works. Anyway, let's talk about ritual a little bit, because you've created some rituals, some earth rituals that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the people, the bog dwellers at Daughter of Black Lake, they really do live and breathe their daily and seasonal rituals. So, you know, they mark the advent of each season with a particular festival. They have ways that they honor each of the gods. For instance, you know, with the least provocation, they touch their lips and then the earth and say blessings of Mother Earth when they want to thank Mother Earth for something. they bury half of all that they harvest to thank Mother Earth for letting them harvest what belonged to her. So, you know, their lives are really driven by these rituals. And I think that, you know, 2000 years ago, again, without science, so much of their world would have been unexplainable. So it must have seemed erratic. They wouldn't have had science to explain, you know, that the weather is about to change, or have had science to explain why the crop failed. They would have just thought there was some, you know, malevolent force, something erratic happening in their lives. So I think that the extent to which the ancient pagans used ritual would have in part been to help them feel at peace, to help bring a little order into their daily lives. I mean, I think they must have innately understood that by following a prescribed you know, set of steps, they could sort of feel peaceful and like they'd created some kind of order. You know, it makes me think of our own uncertain times and makes me wonder if one of the things we shouldn't be doing is sort of upping the ritual quotient in our life. Brunonia mentioned that I'm a yoga instructor, so I've been practicing yoga for more than 20 years and teaching for the last 2. And I mean, yoga is my kind of ritual, the ritual that I use, and it certainly does bring a sense of ease and peace to me. And I think maybe now is a good time where, you know, people need to be embracing ritual a little more. And maybe it's, you know, maybe it's prayer, maybe it's meditation, maybe it's yoga, maybe it's having a practice where you read every night before you go to bed. But I do think maybe the ancient bog dwellers had something to teach us about how to bring a little order to the chaos.
And certainly honoring the earth is something we should pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I do think this book is a great antidote for our uncertain times, as I said. What do you hope readers will take from this?
So there is a point in the story, I'm going to read it to you in a bit, but it's a point in the story where Devout knows for the first time that her daughter Hobble has this ability to predict the future, to see into the future. And she has like really quite a lovely reaction. She says, it's beautiful. Imagine a world without magic. And then she sort of throws open her arms, baffled by the impossibility of such a thing, a world without magic. So, you know, I hope that when readers are reading Daughter of Black Lake, that they will really embrace the mystery and magic that's there on the page. I love the idea that the book opening a tiny crack onto seeing the, you know, the mystery that exists all around us in our daily lives.
That's wonderful. Well, will you read a passage? That would be great.
So it's a short little passage. It's the point in the story where we're hearing from 13-year-old Hobble, and as I mentioned, it's the point where her mother truly gets that her daughter is in fact prophetic. Okay. So my mother and I had been gathering sorrel to flavor our evening soup when my mouth flooded with the taste of metal. I stopped in my tracks and steadied myself for the vision that I knew would come. The metallic taste broadened, and I waited for light. The woodland flashed white, and I saw in my mind's eye how the next moment would unfold. I held up the bottom edge of my dress and fixed my eyes on the thick canopy overhead. As my mother peered upward, squinting to see what I could, a hawfinch fledgling tumbled into the woolen sling of my dress. I went to my knees and began patting dried twigs and leaves into the rough shape of a bowl. My mother continued to scrutinize the canopy, eyes sliding along the high horizontal branches of the beech, but she couldn't spot a nest. I don't see a nest, she said. No, I said, and gently slid the fledgling from my dress to the makeshift nest, where it righted itself, looked up at her, and chirped a dozen times. But you saw a nest, she said. No. Her gaze went to the fledgling. You saw a nest, no nest, but expected a bird to fall? I nodded. She crouched beside me and the tripping fledgling and put a hand on my knee. I see things, I said. My shoulders crept up. I don't know why. She drew me to her, and as my cheek pressed to her breast, she stroked my hair. It's beautiful, she said. Imagine a world without magic. She threw open her arms, baffled by the impossibility.
There it is, right there.
Yeah.
There are passages, don't you think, when you write a book that sum up the, well, not only thematic issues, but sort of the essence?
Right.
Get
Yeah.
what you want.
Yeah.
That was a good choice. Thank you. Well, now I want to move on to writing, because we get a lot of writers at these events, and I see a couple right now. And so, so I have to ask you a little, Diane and Carolyn, stop me when I go too long, okay? Because I'm just going to go on with this till you close the door. Your path to the writing life. When did you turn to writing? And I know you were
Okay. Yeah.
something quite different. And what prompted you?
Yeah. So long and twisted path. I mean, I first put fingertips to the keyboard at 35. My first novel was published at 45. So I'm definitely a writer that came to writing in midlife. You know, probably as a writer, the number one question I get asked is, did I always want to be a writer? And I can tell you that it is a question that I answer with a definitive no. I spent my high school years disgracing myself in English. I was and continue to be one of the world's terrible spellers. It was nothing for me to get upwards of 20% deducted for spelling on, you know, an English essay or an English exam back in high school. In my final year of high school, I took 3 maths and 3 sciences and English only because you had to take it in order to graduate. It was my worst mark by about 10%. When I headed off to university, one of the criteria I used for picking my courses was that there was no writing requirement, that is spelling requirement. And I did graduate with a BSc in biochemistry without having written a single essay. I went on and did my master's in business, but again, I very much steered clear of the written word. So I took as much finance as I could. I spent the bulk of my non-writing work life at IBM. I was there for a little over a decade, at first in finance and then in technical sales. Interestingly, it was while I was at IBM that spell check started to be commonly used, and my world really shifted. You know, I became sort of the departmental wordsmith, the person that would put our proposals together before they went off to the customers. But at the time, I was working with a lot of computer science grads, math grads, engineers, lots of people with English as a second language. And I was pretty sure this supposed ability to write was, you know, not so much that I could write, but that they could not write. You wouldn't guess it, but there was actually quite a bit of evidence of my artistic leanings early on. When I was in high school, I was very involved in classical ballet. So I was in the studio, you know, 4 or 5 nights a week. That might be apparent to anyone who's read my novel, The Painted Girls. And I was also, you know, I sewed and designed pretty much all of my own clothes in high school, which might be apparent to anyone who has read The Day the Fall Stood Still, where the narrator is a seamstress. So, you know, I think in high school, I was feeding my creative side through the dance and the sewing. And then while I was working at IBM in a not very creative job, I was always enrolled in a course at night school, and it was always something with an artistic bent. So there was painting and drawing and art history and interior design and woodworking, and then eventually creative writing. But it was really a whim. I had one of the university calendars at home, and I was flipping pages and I saw this creative writing course. I'd always been a voracious reader, but hadn't really thought at all about writing someday. But I thought, heck, spell check has been invented, you know, why not give it a try? So I did. I took this creative writing course. I remember being smitten right from the very first class. Our first assignment was describing our childhood bedroom. So think about how much fun that could be. So it was a 1-page assignment. I probably spent 8 hours writing it. I loved doing it, and I really wanted it to be perfect. So that was kind of the beginning of the end. And, you know, there's a 4-year period where I was still, you know, cramming in a bit of writing in the evening or taking a class, but still working in the corporate world by day. And then after 4 years, I took the plunge and turned to writing full time, and I've never looked back.
We have a connection at IBM.
Oh, really? You're
I
kidding.
worked for Lotus in tech,
Oh,
marketing,
really?
sales, pretty much until IBM did a hostile takeover of Lotus. And
Wow.
then I
Wow.
cashed in stock and left.
Incredible. I did not know that.
Yeah,
Wow.
isn't that funny?
Hmm.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting how these parallels happen. Um,
Yeah.
that's a fascinating way to get started. And your books are very different. I mean, they really are
Right.
very different from what I did. So I think you have very, very, very varied interests.
I do have varied interests for sure. And I do embrace change. I like change. People ask me often, will I write a sequel to, The Day the Falls Stood Still, which is set in Niagara Falls during the First World War, or will I write another book set in Paris in the 1880s? And, while it would make my life a whole lot simpler if I did, I won't. Like, I like to move on and experience something new and immerse myself in a new time and place and a new culture. It might be born of my love of travel. And I come by my love of travel, honestly. I was raised by two teachers. So we had 5 kids, 2 months every summer, where we would be packed into the VW camper van and, driving all over the place. So, the first trip was across America, down one coast of Mexico into Belize, back up the other side with 7 of us in the camper van for 2 months. So, that sort of began my travels, and they've never ended, except the pandemic has ended them.
Yeah.
There's nothing I love more than getting off an airplane and stepping into a place that smells different and looks different and feels different and, speaks a different language, and the food is different. I love that. So I think, I wonder if this sort of love of being out of my element isn't why I write historical fiction, and why I gravitate toward, books that are set in places that are, a long way from my own experience.
And the places you want to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great. That's a great background, though. That makes perfect sense. Let's talk a little bit about book tours, because in a sense, this is your book tour.
Yeah.
You're launching a book during the pandemic, and not only that, but at an interesting time. I mean, you're Canadian, but this is an interesting time, certainly politically, to launch a book in the U.S.
Yeah.
What have you discovered what isn't different, but are there any benefits to, I mean, one thing I've noticed, for example, is you could, at the Zoom events, you certainly can have people from all over.
Right.
Is interesting. I have a couple, some fans in Italy, but also friends in Australia and Israel that show up at these events often, and that's great because you don't get to do that normally. But so what has it been more of a challenge, or?
At first I was like so nervous about doing these Zoom events, and it seems like there's a lot of stuff that's out of your control, like the technology, and and I mean, I was telling Diane and Carolyn and Brunonia before we got on with all you guys last night, I had this insane dream where I missed this event because I was driving to Niagara Falls with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, it's ridiculous, but obviously born of some kind of anxiety about these virtual events still. So, so I mean, it is wonderful in that there's easy access for people that might not be able to go to events otherwise, that are, not in big cities and whatnot. But I really do miss the sort of face-to-face interaction. And I miss, what happens in Canada when you go on tour is all the literary festivals kind of line up. So you're sort of on tour with the same authors that, have books coming out that season, and you're in Calgary together, then you're in Edmonton, then you have a weekend in Banff where you don't actually do events. It's just like fun. And then you're in Vancouver together. So, and then you all come to Toronto together. So you really get to meet all these authors from all over the world, and you spend about a week with them. And it's a really lovely thing. I might not be quite as introverted as a lot of writers are. So I really look forward to, getting out of my garret and going out there and meeting the reading public and the booksellers and the librarians and the other authors. And so I do feel like I miss that I'm not physically touring. And of course, it is a tricky time right now. We had, you know, with the pandemic, I think about 800 books got shifted from the spring to coming out in the fall, which has made, you know, getting any kind of attention in the fall really tricky. I'm also an author who does a ton of, or has done a ton of live events. You know, I probably did something like 300 for the Painted Girls. So in-person events, and a lot of them just aren't happening. Like, you know, it would be going around to different university women's clubs in Toronto and whatnot. They're just not meeting. I also, you know, I have always Skyped book clubs all over the world, and now I'm Zooming them. So I'm happy to do that and happy that that opportunity exists. But I go to lots of book clubs in Toronto too, and I'm missing that. So yeah.
I miss that too. I go to book clubs. Did you ever, during your travels to book clubs or anywhere, did you ever find out something about any of your books that you didn't know?
All the time.
Yeah, that's
all the time.
I find that too. And readers tell you things they discovered.
Right.
Yeah. Can you tell us
no,
any of
it's
those,
so
or-
interesting talking to readers about, you know, like their interpretations of the books, and you know, some of them, you know, you wonder if you do it subconsciously, but I've certainly had commentary where I'm like, that makes complete sense, and I guess you're smarter than I am because I don't think I thought of it like
Same
so, yeah.
here. I had someone tell me, go to this page, and always read this at every event you go, because this is the essence of the whole book. And I had no idea.
Yeah.
I went, oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
So you take their advice, but you find out so much.
Right.
Maybe what you,
it's just so lovely too. You go to a book club and, you know, you see someone has your book and there's like 100 sticky notes on it, and you're like, oh my God, they've read it with such care and such thought. And it feels like such an honor to have somebody so carefully, thoughtfully consider your work. So yeah.
well, remember that, book clubs.
Yeah.
My book club here will probably be called
Writers fall for sticky notes. Go for it. Yeah.
Yes. Let's see what else. Well, obviously, I wanted to talk to you a little about libraries because we're at the Athenaeum, and
Right.
the Athenaeum's a library. But libraries have been so helpful to me all during my career because they've promoted my books like nobody else.
Yeah.
And well, bookstores do too, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a wonderful library experience too. The Painted Girls actually won the Evergreen Award, which is the Ontario Public Libraries Award. So it's our most populous province here in Canada. And they actually, you know, the librarians pick a list of books, and then they have all the library patrons vote. And meanwhile, they're all pushing your book like crazy, right? So yeah, wonderful support from the librarians. I also had this really wonderful experience when it was before the Painted Girls hit the shelves, and I was on the subway, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Are you Cathy Marie Buchanan?" This doesn't normally happen to writers, right?
No.
This woman came up to me and she said, "Are you Cathy Marie Buchanan?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she's like, "I'm reading an advanced reading copy of the Painted Girls." And she's like, "I love it." And then she's like, "Come with me." She's like, "I'm a librarian, come with me." And she took me over her two friends, which were in the car with her, both librarian in this car with her, and all three of them were reading the Painted Girls.
That's
and
great.
They were like gushing, and I walked out of there and I was like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
It is.
It's great. So big fondness for librarians for sure.
Absolutely. I know I just did an event with a library in Wyoming, in the middle of Wyoming. And I swear they're going to become friends for life. It's just, and it's probably a place I would not have gone on tour because they wouldn't have thought to send me there. But but I'm definitely going to visit when we can.
Yeah, I have a library that I'm particularly fond who, you know, I Skyped with them. They're in Red Deer, Alberta, which is basically nowhere, right? And nobody ever goes to Red Deer, Alberta, but I Skyped with them for both of my, with the Day the Fall Stood Still and the Painted Girls. And I'm Skyping with them. It's coming up for Daughter of Black Lake, but, or Zooming with them actually. But when I was on book tour, I had an event in Calgary, and then I had one in Edmonton, and Red Deer is on the way. So I actually went, and the whole town like came to this event at the library. So it was so great. So they are my library friends for life. Yeah.
That's so great. That's so great. Well, I did want to ask you, and we talked a bit about this before we met tonight, but 2020, what has it been like for you to actually sit down and write something new? Are you
Yeah.
able to do that?
So the beginning of the pandemic, I could not write at all. I think I mean, I need to write from a quiet head, equanimity. I need to be able to focus, have a single-minded focus. And that was not happening at the beginning of the pandemic. I was reading the news. I was scared. I think there was a jitteriness that is still here to some extent, but we've kind of gotten used to it or something. But yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic, I wasn't writing at all. And then the middle of the pandemic, I was getting ready for the launch of Daughter of Black Lake. So doing things like getting my website up and, writing magazine pieces and doing, prepping for interviews and getting together the stuff that would go out to the media and all that sort of stuff. And then this last 3 months of the pandemic, I've been writing again and working on my 4th novel, and I'm happy with how it's going. So yeah.
And speaking of which, now I'm going to ask you your process.
Okay, my process.
Okay. Your process. They always say.
Okay. So I already mentioned that I have a research period that I do up front, and that research period is really a very fertile time for me. I'm making tons of notes. Usually I'm getting a really clear idea about the time and place that I'm writing about, although I talked about how that was a little bit complicated for Daughter of Black Lake. But I love the research process, and I'm definitely a writer that needs to be told to stop researching and get writing. I think researching can be a very lovely procrastination technique, but at some point you need to tear yourself away and start writing. So once I've done the research, it's time to do first draft. For me, first draft is the toughest part of writing a book, and I think there's a couple of reasons why. One, you have a million decisions to make. There are, 100 decisions on every page, right? So, and sometimes they're small, like what color is someone's hair going to be? But sometimes they're big. So is Devout going to fall in love with Ark, or is she going to fall in love with Smith? And it feels like making a wrong choice at one of those turns might send you, down the wrong path, might make you waste a whole bunch of time, or it could make you write a book that's not any good. So all those decisions can weigh super heavily. The other part about writing first draft is you just don't know your characters. So for me, I get to know my characters through the writing process. It doesn't matter if I make lists of characters' traits and, really try to sort them out in my head before I start writing. I get to know them through the writing process. So in the initial part of the book, the characters are inconsistent, they're erratic, their physical appearance is changing on the fly, the way they speak, the way they react. It's just a mess, and then something happens, and I'd say it's around the half to 2/3 mark of the book where the characters start to feel like real flesh and blood people, and they stop being these shadowy, inconsistent, not fleshed out people and emerge as real human beings. And you can predict how your husband or your girlfriend or your best friend is going to react in a certain situation, the way you can sort of tell what they're going to say. It starts to be like that with your characters. And that's a lovely moment when that happens. I've heard other writers say things like, I found my voice, or the character spoke to me. I've heard people say the book wrote itself. But I think we're all talking about that moment where the characters start to feel real and start to lead you through the story. And Brunonia, you said something about that tonight. You said something about how, your ending wasn't what you conceived, but your characters showed you the way. So I think, again,
my character would not do what I needed her to do.
Right.
And,
yeah.
And I just couldn't get her to do it.
Yeah. So when
it's like,
I think before that part happens when you're writing first draft, it just feels like you're writing garbage. And also when you're writing first draft, you're coming off of having polished the heck out of a book. So it's two very different things. In this first draft, you're like, have I forgotten how to write? This is terrible. Like, I can't do this, So
they write very messy first drafts, and you really have to, but don't show them to anyone. Because if you do, especially a writer's group, I think. I test my books with readers.
Really? Wow.
With writers too, but with book clubs, particularly ones I trust, who I've been working with for a while, because I think readers will give you, and I would never do it with a first draft. This is an 8th draft or something, way down the line. but I think they give you a really good perspective about character, particularly.
Mhm.
If something's inconsistent, it stops them all in the same place. You can find out where they stop reading and
Huh,
all.
cool.
Also, I never know where the beginning of a book is. I know pretty much where the end is, but
Yeah.
I write for about 50 to 100 pages before the book starts, and we're always throwing away beginnings. You have the same agent I used to have, Dorian. Is
Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
at one point, Dorian inherited me, and she said, "You in your first book, I don't know if you noticed, but you didn't describe any characters." And I really didn't. I went back and read it again, and I didn't have any
Mm,
physical descriptions except one that had red hair. And she made
mm,
me sit down with a list of physical characteristics of each. It
right.
drove me absolutely crazy. I couldn't do it until I'd been
Huh.
through another whole draft.
Wow. Mhm.
But it was an interesting exercise. But I didn't know I did that. And when I found out, besides that she told me because she wanted it to be different, was that I went to one book club and they started casting the movie, and everybody picked different actors
Right.
for the same
Right.
roles, and and they were arguing with each other
Yeah.
about what the characters looked like. So it's kind of funny. Readers show you a lot, but I test with readers for that reason. But again, not until you're really sure you got
Mhm.
something pretty good. But they always find something that. Now, do you outline?
So when I outline, I have like a, 1 page of bullet points for the whole book. So, and I deviate wildly from it. So I'm, somewhat of an outliner. And because I write historical fiction that is grounded in each of my 3 books has had one lesser known historical figure that we know a few things about. So I'm writing towards something. So the end is sort of the way it is. It hasn't really changed, but the way I get there, I deviate wildly from my outline. I did one event not too long ago with 2 other Canadian writers, and we kind of covered the whole spectrum. It was really interesting. There was Terry Follis, who's an engineer by trade, and he tells me he has 3 pages of bullet points outlining each chapter. And then there was Camilla Gibb, who said, before I start writing, I have a feeling. She said, yeah, I have a feeling. And then I'm kind of in the middle, a bit of an outline, but not really. Terry Follis couldn't believe that we would write a book without knowing exactly, that chapter 2 was going to start in the kitchen and the husband was going to come in and they were going to argue about the dog or whatever, right? So he was super, and he doesn't deviate at all. Yeah, and it was interesting. And then Camilla Gibb turned to Terry Follis at one point, and she was completely genuine, but she said, if you knew how the book was ending, why would you write it?
Oh, interesting.
Just couldn't,
Oh,
for
that's
her,
great.
the point of writing the book was to find out how this all unfolds. And she just thought it was ludicrous that anyone would write a book that they knew how it was going to end.
I love it. I love
Yeah.
it.
So I
Well,
think there's as many ways to write a book as there are writers, right? So
I
yeah.
think that's really true. Really true.
Yeah.
Carolyn has informed me that I think that was the last question. Do we have questions from others, or do we need to end? I always lose track of time. I told you I did and would.
Oh, yes, I know. Yeah, there were a couple of questions in the chat. And if there's anyone else who wants to add a question, now's the time. So let's see. Here's one. In a period novel such as yours, I imagine the role of editor is especially important, even just to make sure there are no modern sayings that slip through. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. So what you're talking about there specifically would be a copy editor's job. So the copy editor, they do things like making sure your grammar and spelling and everything is correct. And they also would look at things like you're using language that's not appropriate to the time. And they would look at like continuity things where, you don't have the person on the second floor and all of a sudden they're walking out the front door. And then they also catch things that you say that are historically inaccurate. So there's that, copy editor's role. And then there's also working with the editors, and that editorial process, we talked a little bit about it before we got going here, but that process for Daughter of Black Lake was a lot longer than it had been for my other books. So once the book sells to a publisher, you're working with a professional editor at the publishing house. And for my other 2 novels, that was sort of 4 months, 6 months, where you're going back and forth with the editor and polishing the book up and making it the best it can possibly be. But for Daughter of Black Lake, that was more like 2.5 years.
Wow.
which is an extraordinary amount of time. And, you know, when they bought the book, they were super excited about it. And then as we were working on it together from an editorial point of view, I was not happy with where the book was going, and they weren't happy either. And at one point I said to them, you know, can I just take this book back, the one that you guys bought, you know, a year and a half ago? Can I go back to that and and you know, do what I want to do with it? And they were cool with that, because we've been sort of struggling with the same issues through all these rewrites, and it just wasn't, you know, one of the rewrites, the book goes back and forth in time 17 years. Some of it's set in year 43, some of it's set in year 60. At one point, they wanted me to rewrite it chronologically so that it started in year 43 and then just progressed through those 17 years. I didn't like that at all, because in the book, the way things are in the later story is really informed. As you learn about what happened in the early story, it explains so much in the later story. And I just didn't like that rewrite. Another of the rewrites that I mentioned, the young girl Hobble used to be told by her father. So that was a big rewrite. So each of these rewrites is sort of a 6 or 8 month effort. So, you know, and generally I love the rewriting process, and I love working with editors. Like working with editors, it feels so wonderful that, you know, after you've been off by yourself writing for a couple of years, all of a sudden you've got people, you know, reading your work and really committing themselves to wanting to understand what it is you're trying to communicate, and to making this book be the best it can possibly be. So, but with Daughter of Black Lake, 2.5 years, I was kind of like, if you guys want one more word changed, I'm throwing the book out the window. I am so done with this book. And I've heard writers say things like, you know, you're finished when you can't stand to read one more word. And I was so there. So yeah.
Well,
So
it
yeah,
works.
working with editors, super important. But wow, this last go, I was really done with the editorial process. And even though I say that, you know, I said how hard writing first draft is, I'm writing first draft again, and I'm delighted to be writing first draft.
Great.
Are you able to tell us what time and place you're working in now, or?
Yeah, so I've gone back all the way to 1962 this time. So the research was a lot easier than it was for Daughter of Black Lake. So the book I'm working on now is set during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's just set over the week of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on the Monday night, Monday, October 22nd, President Kennedy comes on TV and says, you know, there are Russian missiles in Cuba aimed at America. They can blow us all to smithereens. And this situation was resolved by the end of the week, by the Sunday. So it takes place over the course of that week. There are 4 characters that tell the story. So 4 different points of view. And each of those characters is facing a major decision. And the fact that the world might be blown to smithereens at any moment is really impacting the way they're making their decisions.
Some of us remember that time.
Yeah, loads of people. Yeah, it's, you know, I mean, anyone that's got 10 years on me remembers exactly what they were doing and how scary it was. And yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I can't wait to read that one.
Yeah.
Can't wait to read them all. So keep going.
Yeah. And then there was one last comment. Jean Marie said she stayed up until 2 a.m. finishing Daughter of Black Lake. She couldn't put it down. And in addition to the topics you already discussed, I enjoyed the details you included about how technological advancements helped the Britons accept the Romans.
Right. So in Daughter of Black Lake, the community really, they are sitting on, you know, the knife's edge of great change, right? They're on the cusp of great change. The Romans have come. They have brought all kinds of technology. They have brought the written word. They have brought coins. They have brought aqueducts. They know how to build roads. They know how to fight, you know, organized warfare. So they brought all kinds of things to the Britons. And my little community at Daughter of Black Lake, some of the people in the community are embracing change. They want to participate in the change. Smith, the blacksmith, has learned how to temper steel from the Romans. He sees opportunity, But like in any society on the cusp of change, there are people that are clinging to the old ways. So people that fear change, people that don't want to lose the only way that they know of existing in the world. And in Daughter of Black Lake, the Druid character Fox is one of those people that is clinging to the old ways. So before the Romans came, the Druids had absolute authority. They were the decision makers. You know, they were the guys with all the powers and all the power. And you know, we see Fox clinging to his privilege, we would say, just as we see in society now, people cling to their you know, their privilege in the face of great change. So yeah, you know, I've had a couple of readers say to me, you know, it's so great that like you wrote this book that parallels sort of some of our modern issues, and how clever of you. And I'm like, I started writing this book 7 years ago. Like there was, you know, I wasn't sitting there thinking I'm going to write a book that addresses, you know, the place we are right now, which I think is in a place of great change.
Yes.
I think that's it, unless anyone else has any other questions they want to throw in there.
Well, I want to say thank you to the Athenaeum, but also to Cathy for being so open and sharing this information with us.
Yeah, well, thank you to the Athenaeum for are we okay? Oh, so, no, thank you so much for.
Oh no, you go ahead. That's,
like, what
we're just
yeah. So thank you very much to Carolyn and Diane for getting this all organized, and thank you, Brunonia, so very much for you know, reading my work with such heart and being such a wonderful supporter of mine and Daughter of Black Lake. I bowing down, very, very much appreciated.
Thank you. Keep writing, and we'll
You
see.
too. Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Thanks to you both, and thanks to our audience as well.